Being bright and early to start the second day of this wonderful annual event. And it's really a tremendous pleasure for me to be back here for the fourth year in a row. And I find what Jennifer has accomplished truly amazing and important, and your presence is the essence of it. I'm going to talk about the U.S. today. This is a break from the past, but a reflection of my growing anxieties about the United States in its politics, its public health, its ability to face a growing number of challenges that this country faces. And I felt that it would be timely to do so in the midst of the budget debates that have been underway and a prime spectacle for all of us in the last few weeks. Now, the U.S. does not have the most pressing crisis in the world by any means. And many of you coming from other parts of the world have truly more urgent challenges, and your country's or region's problems are the ones that the world needs to focus on. But one of the features of our world today is the nearly complete neglect by the United States of these global problems. Now, if there's any attention by the U.S., it is in public health, because the neglect by the U.S. of other global problems, climate, hunger, environmental degradation, lack of education, and so forth, is even more striking than in the public health arena. And it's shocking, in fact. And so talking about the U.S. crisis will at least help those of you from abroad understand this weird spectacle that is taking place in this country. We have a paradox in the United States, and that is that the U.S. is an incredibly rich society that has more resources, more wealth, more income, more technology, more knowledge, more capacity than it knows what to do with. And in a lot of ways, despite all of this, it's in an increasingly deep crisis. It can no longer solve problems for the rest of the world, and it can't even solve its own problems. And for those of you in the U.S., this talk is really about what we as citizens might be able to do to help pull this country back from a growing crisis. For those of you in the rest of the world, it is coming from the rest of the world. I hope that it's a little bit of a window on what must seem awfully strange to be watching the U.S. in near paralysis, lack of any effective responses to global crises, on the verge of one political breakdown after another. It is a paradox, and it's a paradox that needs understanding. I don't have a full explanation of it, and so I can't give you a full accounting of how it is that a highly successful society 30 or 40 years ago has increasingly been unable to address real problems in an intelligent way, and how we've slipped into an almost mind-bogglingly bizarre politics in the last few years, when almost everything that's said is a lie or a distortion or propaganda, and by both parties. I'm not going to give a partisan talk. I am deeply unhappy with our politics, not just with the hyper-bizarre Republican Party, but also the moderately bizarre Democratic Party. And so I won't show you my partisan tastes. But basically, I'm not quite equal opportunity, unhappy with both parties. And we need to understand what's happening. And so if you'll forgive me from what I've always enjoyed and benefited from talking about here, which is the global scene, and particularly the crises in the poorest countries of the world. My wife Sonia will very ably handle that in a few minutes, and I'm going to focus on the crisis of affluence in the United States, and especially the political economy of the U.S.
clicker work?
Whoa. So, the U.S., like other high-income countries, is suffering from a variety of structural challenges. By that I mean our challenges are not accidents of who won the 2008 election or the 2000 election or exactly what the Democrats said or what the Republicans said or what Ronald Reagan did in 1981 and so forth, though all of those things count. They are part of the dynamic. There are deeper phenomena underway, partly global, partly domestic, and partly the interaction. I do believe at some level that the biggest drama in the world in political economy is the drama of globalization itself. By that I mean the fact that because of technology and geopolitics, the world economic system has tremendously changed in recent decades to become an interconnected system of trade, finance, technology, production, and movement of capital and people. This interdependence, of course, we call globalization. Globalization's been a fact of life for the world for at least a couple thousand years since Han China traded with the Roman Empire. But the intensity of globalization has changed its character in recent decades. After World War II, the world was divided between the small part of the rich world, Europe, the United States, Japan, still struggling with post-World War II recovery. There was the socialist world under the Soviet dominance, and then there was the post-colonial world that was largely identified geopolitically with the non-aligned movement. And these divisions meant that the world was not united in trade or finance. It's those divisions and technology which has fundamentally changed our whole global scenario. In technology, we know that it's the unbelievable advances in transport, communications, and data management. The digital era, containerization, the dramatic breakthroughs in low-cost transport, which made it possible for the world production system to become a deeply interconnected whole, so that almost any sophisticated product is made in from components made in dozens of countries. It was the change of geopolitics, starting most fundamentally with the choice of a number of smaller Asian economies, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, in the 1960s, and then most fundamentally with the People's Republic of China in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping came to power, to become part of a globalized trading system that has changed the nature of geopolitics and the world political orientation towards the economy. The divisions between first, second, and third worlds and opportunities, both financial capital and physical capital, the owners of enterprise, new investment opportunities in China, in the emerging economies, and this immediately led to new profit opportunities. It was, on the whole, quite good for capital in all parts of the world. But it also led to a contest among countries to attract capital. And that leads to a phenomenon that is known as the race to the bottom, meaning that different political jurisdictions, whether it's states within the U.S. or whether it's the U.S., whether it's Wall Street vis-a-vis the City of London, or whether it's the United States vis-a-vis other countries, compete for this internationally mobile capital by cutting taxes, cutting regulations, and generally catering to a very powerful financial and political interest that is mobile, that has choice. And so intrinsically also globalization, in my view, has put the thumb on the scale towards tax cuts and deregulation for powerful sectors of the economy. Globalization has also meant, in a variety of ways, a tremendous squeeze on jobs and incomes of the bottom half of the income distribution. Essentially, when China joined the world market, and then India about 13 years later with its economic opening in 1991, and many, many other parts of the world as well, in effect, hundreds of millions of relatively low-skilled workers with a low educational attainment, to just leave it at that, entered a globalized economy. And that meant that jobs that are carried out predominantly by high school graduates or those without a high school degree could now migrate to low-wage economies through many different kinds of processes: outsourcing, offshoring, replacing supplier chains, going to export processing zones, and so on. And what occurred virtually in all of the high-income world was a relative stagnation or decline of wages of what used to be kind of core middle class, a high school diploma in a manufacturing job. Those basically disappeared. And increasingly, jobs that could be outsourced or offshored through the internet, through business process operations in India most famously, but also occurring in many other places, also meant wage pressures for basically the lower 3, but even possibly 4 quintiles, in other words, the lower 60% of the income distribution. The only reliable winners in this within the U.S. context would be at the top quintile, but within the top quintile, even the top few percent within that, the top 1%, the real financial wealth holders. And one should remember that financial wealth is so unevenly distributed that the top 1% of net worth households in this country have more wealth than the poorest 90% of households. So when we talk about financial wealth, it's completely concentrated at the very top. Globalization meant one other thing, and that is the world economy actually picked up steam because of China's rapid growth and the rapid growth of other emerging markets, and that has exacerbated tremendously the onset of deep environmental risks. Just think, for example, that China has now overtaken the United States as the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. The U.S. for 2 centuries basically dominated, maybe not 2 centuries, but at least a century, dominated in the emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning. But China has been growing so rapidly, doubling in size every 7 years over a 30-year period, that around 2007 or 2008, China, in absolute amount, now emits more carbon dioxide than the U.S. And of course, China is a coal-burning economy, fundamentally. Coal being the most carbon dioxide intensive of all energy sources. And so this adds to the environmental burden. But we're seeing the environmental costs of this rapid global